Hello everyone, today we talk about the relations of Poland with France, the Habsburgs, and the Ottomans at the death of Fazil Ahmed Köprülü and the consequent rise of Kara Mustafa. So you know that the commander of the 1683 siege of Vienna. The Polish perspective, so this takes place in 1676, because the diplomatic background is quite interesting and the Polish position is quite interesting, especially in the relation with France and of course also in function with, as we will see now, especially Royal Hungary with the Habsburgs, and naturally this important change of direction that historiographically is being given a bit for granted, in my opinion, as it wasn't automatic for Poland just to descend so openly next to the Habsburgs, even against the threat of the fall of the same Vienna, right? That surely would have changed a lot of things in Central Europe. Now we'll partially analyze that, but also talk about it further in other videos. And given the how much Jan III Sobieski owed to France, that is his crown fundamentally, and also the strange French diplomatic, the strangeness of a French diplomatic effort in the same year to try to convince Poland to change course, or better to maintain course of action. In any case, this was a very important random fact. In those years everything could change, right? I like this topic, this context in general, because it shows you how complicated politics is, and consequently also how reality is modified by that. And in this military interest of ours as Clausewitzians, we know that, but it's only through history that we can see how real that was, right? At the time, the news arrived quite noisily, let's say, even though at the moment, right, it was not much of a thing per se. On November the 3rd, 1676, had the Grand Vizier Fazil Ahmed Köprülü had died on the road between Constantinople and Edirne, struck down perhaps by those long fatigues of war and government, and also, as likely by his not too Quranic passion for intoxicating beverages. In any case, he had been followed immediately, without any difficulty. A brother, an adoptive brother of his, that was also his own brother-in-law, by the way. That is, in fact, Kara Mustafa, who, from his very first steps of government, had given signs to be wanting to resuming the way of the Balkan expansion that really was important for an empire like the Ottoman one, because taking a direction or another was a huge deal. The Ottoman Empire was normally at war on 3 different fronts, right? And concentrating its forces on a major theater rather than another was a big deal, making, like in this case, history taking very interesting turns. That passed through the same Kara Mustafa, and in fact had immediately began to insist in such sense towards Sultan Mehmed IV, who was also importantly younger than him, and subjected to his advice consistently, because Mehmed was fascinated with Kara Mustafa. And this pressure was coming not just from Kara Mustafa's conviction that the moment was propitious, but also because he was personally enticed by the rich perspectives of loot that the Balkan enterprise would have personally procured him. Kara Mustafa was an intelligent and lucid man, but also an ambitious, cruel, avid, and distrustful one, and as it relatively rarely happened among the high dignitaries of the Ottoman court, he was Islamic by birth, right? He was the son of an Anatolian Sipahi, and his contempt towards Christians and Europeans was authentic and deep, as much as the respect towards the Köprülü family that had adopted him. But at least he hadn't shared the passion of his brother-in-law for alcoholic beverages. And he had an important naval experience. In 1663, he had been appointed admiral of the Sultanian fleet of the Aegean Sea. And it's by covering this office that he had entered in diplomatic courtesy relation with the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Ferdinand II, to whom also he made he gifted with a splendid illuminated copy of the Shahnameh of Firdausi, that is today is kept at the Central Library in Florence. And in this position he had also measured himself with the Venetian navy. And as we were saying before, Kara Mustafa's immediate objective was northern Hungary, but from there the Sultanial arms could have threatened both Austria and Poland equally. However, the military commitment of Kara Mustafa's army against the Cossacks and Russia prevented him, up to the Russian-Ottoman armistice of 1681, to be thinking seriously to the Hungarian front. And the news concerning the new political climate that was being breathed on the Bosphorus ran fast, because it was known essentially what kind of different political orientation the new Grand Vizier would have given. And in Central Eastern Europe especially, the feeling that time was running out by then was rising. And the reason being that the truce that had been stipulated at Vasvar after the imperial victory on the Ottoman army at the Battle of St. Gotthard hadn't quite solved the problems. At that point, Montecuccoli basically had prevented the fall of Vienna, right? It had belated the siege for 20 years, but the Ottomans would have come back anyway, and Vienna at that point had time to reinforce its defenses. Was probably the size of Rome. But the main problem was the instability that occurred all along the frontier, the pretty long frontier line that, as you know, the Habsburgs had also functionalized over the centuries, right? As this the Krajina, as a matter of fact, it was also a Slavic term, as the idea of the frontier. So from which the term Ukraine and other Slavic frontier lands, as was perceived as such, really were. And along this frontier, so between Austria and Hungary, there was I'd say different areas, right? There is the Royal Hungary, that is under the Habsburgs. Then some areas also of the Stamland were threatened, and then there was Ottoman Hungary, right, in Budapest and so on. So this area was quite unstable, right? Hungary had been a great state in the Middle Ages. Now everything had collapsed and kind of militarized along this line with a reciprocal raids that were a chronic evil, right? And so imagine the distractions, the impossibility of founding something more stable there. So the string of violence had ended up to procuring damage, to which, in fact, at the time, the contendants were habituated, but that complexively were enormous, right? So again, independently from these major expeditions that happened, right, just rarely, every some generation at some point, it was a continuous warfare made up of destruction, raiding, and with all the misery stemming from that, and a continuous pressure that, especially from the Habsburgic side, was difficult to measure clearly. We made a video, I think it's titled Marcia alla Turca, where it explains how the Ottoman army from Edirne actually marched to Vienna, and up to a relatively few time before, the Westerners knew that the army was arriving, but like it couldn't really be told because it was always there from quite a while, this kind of hot frontier from which you couldn't really tell whether a new army would have emerged, right? Suddenly it was intensifying in the anticipation of a major offensive or not. It was quite a problem. It was a bit the strategic mode of what was happening with the Ottomans, the Tartars, etc. in the East. It was, in part, was reflected also tactically. We've seen it many times. Skirmishing, screening sometimes on the bulk of the army that you don't know whether it's there or not. Albeit, naturally, strategic, say, the presence of such an army like the one in 1683 was like, you just know it's coming. You just know it's there, right? You can't really hide it, right? It's just, again, you may never know how much can a single military operation can escalate, right? Can be the step on a ladder of escalation, as you have eventually, in order to stem it, to commit larger amount of forces, right? Even if it starts from skirmishes, right? If it intensifies, you have to put a patch on it, and it costed a lot. And we've seen all the financial difficulties of the Habsburgs in doing this. So the common feeling at the time, say between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans, and also the opinion of the other, the European chancelleries in general, was that the situation on the Ottoman-Habsburgic frontier in Hungary had deteriorated so much that hoping in a renewal of the truce of Basvar was old by then, would have been folly. But this, albeit being clear for those who directly knew the interested territories, could also be not entirely clear to those same chancelleries of the capitals that were observing things from far away and that had lots of other issues on their own, so not to focus strictly on those, not because they didn't have agents, etc. But they, of course, could say, well, all the things that are happening in the world, we're not focused and wired to it as much as the Habsburgs, the Ottomans are. And from his side, Louis XIV of France seemed satisfied. In fact, he was, because of the clouds that were thickening on the Balkan Peninsula, and he was profiting of it, both to reinforce his pressure on Spain, still Habsburgic Spain at the time, remember, in order, to make the Spaniards abandoning the United Provinces, their fort against resisting France, and also for essentially annexing mile after mile with a mile after mile a pretense of legitimacy that was backed by his jurists hunting for old feudal rights in the so-called Chambre de Réunion, the imperial territories of the Rhineland, where, as you know, France was essentially directing most of its efforts and succeeding, also because the area was dramatically fragmented from a political point of view. So the French diplomacy in Constantinople was blowing on fire, let's say, encouraging the Grand Vizier to attack the Habsburgs from the Balkans, and this would have provoked an unavoidable reaction that committing Leopold of Habsburgs against it would have left to the Sun King free hand on the Rhine front. This was always the thing at the point. France hoped to block the Habsburgs on the Eastern Front in order to distract imperial forces from the Rhineland, where also, they had been deployed. They were deployed previously. It was, an important net of alliances and pro-Habsburgic faction, let's say, of the empires, that many others didn't really care, nor about the Habsburgs, nor about the Ottomans invading Central Europe. We have seen this too in other contexts. But at this point, the political orientation of John III of Poland began to change. This was fundamental, right? The King of Poland, in fact, had not had easy relations with the Habsburgs. He owed his crown to the French, right? And he had been making pressure, especially through the Magyar dissidents in Royal Hungary, that, let's repeat it, was under the Habsburgs. Hungary was between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans at the same time, as you know, from centuries at that point. Because he hoped that, this was the point, they would have offered, right, Royal Hungary would have offered St. Stephen's crown, so the rule of the country, either to him or his first born son, Jakub, his heir, or better. This was the problem, because Poland was an elective monarchy, and so Hungary was. So this was a bit of a institutional impasse that, however, these powers were trying to surpass, to give more stability to their own countries. But as you know, it was complicated because Central European monarchies at large had remained de facto elective. So Sobieski had to confrontate with the Schlacht. I mean, even in Germany, in theory, there was the possibility of, emperors coming from other backgrounds, not just the Habsburgic one. And so Hungary was. And the hope was therefore to kind of strip the Habsburgs of this important Central European land that would have been like a wedge in which, Poland would have entered. And this was historically so because, the relations between Austria, Poland, Hungary, etc. had always been somewhat in common, and the instability, the chronic instability of that area was still, from the side of such a large power like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, an important infiltration area. It was the problem of Transylvania as well. We'll see it in a while, because the Sun King had made everything, if not in order to convince the Hungarian magnates to second them, at least to make them believe that this was the nature of things. I mean, the Hungarians hope to become. It's complicated, right? We have seen also with Turkey, we made a video about him that he would have taken easily an Hungarian crown from the Ottomans, right? As being bringing Hungary under his entire control. The Habsburgs were a foreign rule of some sort, even though the concept of nationality didn't quite work in the same way we're habituated to think today, especially in Central Europe at the time. But fundamentally, the game was France supporting, let's say, the anti-Habsburgic faction in Royal Hungary by being allied with the Ottomans, and at this point using also Poland as a sort of creation to, erode the Habsburgs further. And in a sense also, of course, caring for the relation between these other powers, but the main aim just distracting the Habsburgs from the Rhine. Right? So anything that could happen in the east, right? Putting all the effort, concentrating all the international forces in this fashion. And speaking of Transylvania, it was the same, because the Habsburgs historically had kind of expanded also through what essentially at today's territories of Slovakia and further east towards the Carpathians, and so the idea that, for example, the Prince Mihaly Apache would be brought to some higher level. At this point, it was an important peak of Transylvanian power that later would be kind of declining in the 18th century, but it was there, and the weakening of the Habsburgic position and a French support were a good option for these princes. So aside from the awareness of such diplomatic ambiguities that, in a sense, for great leaders, great states, let's say, are always an interesting field to play on, right? Because you have always many options at the same time, so you don't have to radically shift. But it's obvious that an Ottoman invasion was something very big, was really a big, step in that situation, with a kind of evident and macroscopic international access being benefited, in which Poland wouldn't quite play that role, because John III knew very well, nor he forgot, by the way, to be owing largely to the French king his crown, right? He had remained up to that point a loyal ally of the Sun King, but he realized very well that a further expansion of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkan Danubian region was the very high price that Central Eastern Christendom would have had to pay in exchange for essentially the expansion of France in Western Europe instead. Because it was evident that nobody else except from the Sultan and the Sun King would have gained from an Ottoman invasion of at that point. In fact, it was either, they didn't know it yet, it could be Austria or Poland, right? John knew very well the Ottomans. He had measured himself in battle against them, famously, and he knew that the Sublime Gate had never renounced to the perspectives to expand its influence north of the Black Sea through with the help, at least of the Tartars of Crimea, that were, this great force kind of creating problems on the southeastern frontier of the Commonwealth. And this, in spite of the peace treaties, constituted a threat objectively for the same Poland. It was obvious, right? With the Ottomans, for example, settled in the fortress of Kamenec, there was a hell of a, I don't know if it's in Ukraine, if you've ever seen some pictures, that's beautiful, by the way. But there, it was like a nest where the Ottomans had consolidated a constant threat, a base of operations, eventually for even attacking Poland itself. Right, we will see it now in a while. So it was unreasonable to support such a situation for the exclusive advantage of the King of France, and that was, by the way, also sustaining his aims on the imperial territories of the Rhine, which meant that, say, in the worst of scenarios, Vienna had been taken. and France would have, let's leave aside what the Ottomans would have done, we'll talk about it in a while, but France would have stepped into Germany quite easily, right? And next door was Poland. So at that point, Poland would have had the French in the west, the Ottomans in the south and in the east, right? Protestants in the north. So the situation was pretty grim. Would have been pretty grim. Naturally, such catastrophic scenario was, let's say, still we are in 1676. The thing had not happened, but exactly as we've seen, the accession to power of Kara Mustafa had, rendered it more plausible. And this is, however, the point. We know eventually how history went, but let's say it's a bit too deterministic to pretend that Poland would have stepped in to help the Habsburgs anyway. Especially at this point, they were still toying with the idea of rather not doing so, and maybe exploiting further the situation for obtaining their, what they consider would have liked as their royal Hungary, etc. But in the most catastrophic of scenarios, of course, this thing came to be, and still, however, great difficulties. We made a video about papal diplomacy behind Vienna 1683. We've seen the, enormous, gigantic, incredible effort that even just the papacy made, all the enormous amount of money invested to bring eventually the Poles in, right? Which shows how kind of distrustful these were towards the general situation, because of course France also were more distant than Germany for the Poles. So to influence the change in diplomatic address, let's say, of the Polish king, weighed also the opinion of his wife, who was French, as a matter of fact, but that towards the Sun King nourished some sort of resentment because of some promises, not maintained promises of privileges denied to her family in France. And further, to this, distance from France contributed the project of the Polish royal couple to transform the Polish monarchy from an elective to an hereditary one, which this Lacta had always kind of prevented. So a new perspective in such sense, as we were saying before, was an Habsburgic marriage for which Warsaw's diplomacy had been working importantly. Because this would have brought, plausibly, at least John Sobieski thought that, to the foundation of a solid dynastic alliance with the Habsburgs, right, through to a marriage especially of his son Jakob with a princess of imperial blood. And the negotiations that were led by the apostolic nuncio in Vienna, Buonvisi, that knew the Polish situation very well, would have essentially concluded themselves into very few, because the royal couple in Warsaw, as we were saying before, pretended that the wife-to-be, that was the Archduchess Maria Antonia of Habsburg, to bring in dowry the Kingdom of Hungary. As we've seen, what would have been even, feasible, practically speaking. It was not an unrealistic political idea, but it was unsustainable from an, formal institutional one, given the elective nature of the crown of that kingdom. And in any case, this change of John III's diplomatic behavior, say from Paris towards Vienna, appeared rather certain, right? There was authoritative group of Polish magnates, at the head of which was Andrzej Trzebiski, Bishop of Krakow, right? So the second most important, and the historical capital, like Warsaw was already the capital of Poland, but that was also kind of a more, it was closer to Austria, even just conceptually, and more directly exposed in this sense, even to an Ottoman invasion. But this was the thing, right? The Ottomans could invade the Danube Valley or the Vistula Valley through Krakow, through Warsaw, etc. Backed the king in this policy of distancing from the too tight alliance with France. That was also just here a bishop, the head of them, of course, in the most Catholic Poland. That would have not been strange anyway, but here again it was the impious fetus of France being allied with the Ottomans, factually, right? Even if not formally, but quite evidently and notoriously so. So this was, and this was true in many other ways, because France had been supporting the Protestants in Germany, Northern Europe, even interfering with Polish affairs, because there were Protestants there too, historically, and around Poland. And so even in these southern lands, like as we've seen, Hungary, Carpathia, naturally also the Poles in many ways were looking at the Protestants in that kind of instrumental fashion sometimes, right? It was the normal political game. But macroscopically speaking, again, this was about France supporting the Ottomans to invade either Austria or Poland. That for the both of them would have been terrifying anyway. So they would have, because they knew that they just would have been next, right? So that's what brought them. But it took that scale of threat to trigger that situation, because otherwise there were other threats that would change. There were a different game still at this time. So this had already been realized, by the way, before Kara Mustafa's rise to power. So it was a real, internal Polish thing in many ways by the French envoy in again April of '76 to Warsaw, which let's say with rich gifts that were destined to the Augustan royal cap. Right, this diplomat was François Gaston de Bethune, that found himself to cope with the coldness and even the hostility of the Queen. In spite, he was actually her own brother-in-law, given that he had, the Marquise had married a sister of hers, the sister of hers. And in fact, Bethune's wife was actually even against her own sister, because she was jealous of her having become Queen of Poland, right? Just descending from, being actually part of the, not really minor, but still not particularly relevant French nobility, right? She had turned into the Queen of Poland. And this sister seemingly hoped for a crown, a royal crown for herself. So there was this kind of weird game behind it as well. So the formal conclusive act of this political turn was sanctioned by the baptism of the third born son of John and Maria Kazimiera, that was the Queen of Poland, Alexander, who that happened in Warsaw in the year after, and godmother and godfather of whom were the Empress, right, the wife of Leopold I, and the Pope, right, quite eloquently. So showing France that this was the third born son. Consider the couple had in between Jacob and Alexander was the second born was a daughter, Theresia, that would have married in 1695 also the Elector of Bavaria, Maximilian Emanuel. So another marriage in the Habsburgic from a Habsburgic side, right? So showing France that the Polish royal dynasty was uniting ever more with the Habsburgs and with the Pope that was, let's say, traditional for Poland, the latter, I mean, but quite meaningfully assessing that, as it was the case at the time, the Pope was working importantly with the Emperor in an anti-Ottoman and thus also anti-French fashion. So what had happened in Poland, together with the new phase of the annexation policy of the Sun King towards the territories in the east and in the northeast of his reign, talking about not just the Rhineland, but properly the Netherlands as well as a policy, was determining a strong change in the balance of the entire Europe. This was something new, right? Susceptible, provoking even deeper novelties, and that had been seen in recent times. So the Ottoman interference in this would have been even greater than this, right? It would have shifted even more the balance practically, because France at least had basically everybody against in the West. If the Ottomans came in the game, they would have shifted an enormous amount of, directly at least, an enormous amount of balance. So the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, emboldened by the success obtained in the northeastern borders of the Ottoman Empire, was looking with growing interest towards the northwest. We were saying before, the Western diplomats, including the Venetians, attributed him great and very daring dreams, including the recurrent one of the Ottoman leaders, that is to catch the golden apple that could be either Vienna but also Rome. And so the scary prophetic image of the Turkish horses that drank from the basins of St. Peter was coming back, and the conquest of the Eternal City as a sign of the end of times was also still kind of propheticized, let's say, or in some ways by some pietistic and mystic Islamic currents, an exponent of one of which was Mehmed Fani Effendi. It was the spiritual director of the Grand Vizier himself. This is an interesting figure. There's not much online. He was born in 1634. Perhaps he died in Bursa in 1685. And so there was a renewed effort, if you want, of the older universal dream of the Ottomans to take one of the major capitals of Catholicism, Roman Catholicism. And it's the case of saying this again, even excluding Paris, but not just because of geographical reasons, because of course, again, everybody, as we were saying before, was doing their own interest, even in Europe, leaving the Habsburgs, the Venetians, the Poles really coping with their own Ottoman problem by themselves. But it was still realistic in some way. The problem was rather where, right? So was it possible, for example, to head on Rome, right? Simply ignoring the objective reality in order to conquest would have been necessary to neutralize in some way, at least militarily or diplomatically alike, her three Catholic shields, that is Vienna, Venice, and Warsaw, right? It was even possible to dream that the same friend and maybe even ally, France, would have, allowed to render herself at the front of the eyes of Christendom accomplice of something so terrible, right, and enormous, right? Consider that this Roman rhetoric, of course, was old, right? The recurrent claims on, both on the conquest of Rome had naturally in the Ottoman world the same value of the pretense that in the Christian one was the liberation of Jerusalem that remained. Still, however, the formal milestone, right? Even let's say on the level of public declarations and also canonic law, doesn't matter how utopistic at that point, of any crusading enterprise, right? So, leaving aside this dream of Rome that is quite unrealistic, and just looking at the, let's say, southeastern Europe, let's put it in this way, the Ottoman government would have found himself in front of the old problem of the choice between the naval or the terrestrial attack. So the naval one would have to be headed against Venice, and terrestrial one along the Balkan-Danubian axis. And alternative that were essentially the only possible ones against the West, not just for logistical but also simply political reasons, right? How could you attack Rome, right? It was possible. You had to circumvent the entire, the Italian fleets, the various straits. It was ridiculous and useless, right? So the only actual goals could be waged against Venice, that, however, as we will see, had inflicted to the Ottomans during the War of Candia an enormous loss of blood, something incredible. In fact, the Ottomans wouldn't choose that path again. It was absurd to think also of an aggression led on both fronts that would have had as a result the immediate alliance between Venice and the Habsburgs, and for which objectively the Ottoman Empire didn't have nor the means nor the energy for sustaining. Venice was calm after all, because even there, what do? You want to besiege Venice? That is an enormous logistical effort. I mean, again, you bottle yourself up in the Adriatic, far from the major centers of your power, and with which guarantee, by the way, that it could even be possible, given what the Venetian navy and others could put together, right? So it was too much of a risk, and eventually for really getting, in case of failure, not even any sound territorial achievement, right, or possibility of spreading further via land in areas that are separated by seas. It's terrifying. The Venetians were the first ones of knowing that a direct Ottoman threat towards her was not feasible. Also, as we just said, reaching the Tiber mouth was de facto for the vizier a foolish hope. Instead, the one of the Danube and of the Vistula seemed instead relatively viable choices, surely at the hand of the Ottoman army in that moment. And of course, it was anyhow the behavior of the new Grand Vizier to appear provocatory and threatening towards both the emperors and the Poles. It was evident already, even before any factual plan of the 1683 siege. This justified alone politically that siding of Poland and Austria, that with John III was also happening for other reasons that we have partially seen here. Naturally, the Ottoman government was confident also relatively to this in the in the support of the King of France. That was, after all, backing in Hungary in Royal Hungary the anti-Habsburgic faction, and thus the pro-Ottoman one in a way. Some Magyar magnates that had been exiled after the repression of 1671 had chosen as refuge Poland. Interestingly enough, because again this shows how much the Poles, also as French allies, were seen as reliable. And up to that point, in fact, the Poles had supported themselves the Hungarian dissidents, let's put it in this way. But the Sun King had gone further, right, to conclude with the exiled rebels a formal treaty in which he accepted as King of France the role of their defensor, even instructing a small Hungarian-Polish military corps by French officials, and to grant in May 1677 the inauguration in Warsaw of a sort of Hungarian provisional government in exile under the aegis of the French ambassador, the Bethune, that we've seen before. And for this reason, the French government had sent in Transylvania, at the court of the Apache, the diplomat Akakia Dufresne, to work, together with the Magyar rebels, let's say, and the embassies, the French embassies in Warsaw and in Constantinople, kind of bridging them also, kind of as a frontier land. And the project of alliance between the Magyar rebels, the Prince of Transylvania, and the King of France, that entailed also, as we've seen, the organization of this small kind of common military force, had been veered in November 1676. So the condescendence of the Polish court in front of all what the Sun King had determined in his conviction, that would later reveal itself a mistake, that the signals of coldness from that direction would have began to pervene towards him, just as the temporary result of the irritation of Maria Kazimiera, were effectively the new course impressed by John III in his politics of alliance, and dissipating quite quickly, quite soon, the misunderstanding. After all, Louis XIV had in turn promised to the Sublime Gate that this time, differently from what had happened in the past, his neutrality, say, we explain now what it means, in the Hungarian affairs would have been most rigorous. Why? That is, the fact that there could be a ban, properly let's say at least formally and officially, in preventing the departure from France of eventual French voluntary contingents made up of, chivalric hotheads who were impatient to measure themselves with the infidels. Think about Prince Eugene, that was among them, as it had instead happened during the War of Candia, right, where this French, flamboyant French unit landed in Crete and got themselves massacred. Right, on the other, these were all volunteers. They still believed in the crusade. They still believed in the clash against the infidel, in nobility, aristocracy, universal pride, tradition, etc. They were saying, we don't care about what our king says. We are gentlemen. We go out there and we'll fight for what we believe is holy. And the same had happened in the Balkan campaign concluded with the Truce of Vasvar. At the Battle of St. Gotthard, in Montecuccoli's imperial army, there were Germans, there were Slavs, there were Italians, but there were also French. And they were of that kind, right? So there was this interesting, consider it in a moment in which France was tightening, say, properly as a state, right? Some important control on an authority and discipline on the country, and creating a professional, permanent, truly national army for the first time in history. These noblemen that were still part, however, of an ancien regime structure, couldn't quite be restricted fully, right? It was an important political move. And so now Louis XIV was saying to Constantinople, we will not let that these men were going out there to support the Habsburgs, right? And that was an important answerance that was granted to the Ottomans, because the French were also kind of, noble and crazy, and on the battlefield they would get themselves killed and fighting like hell with their own. Again, take Prince Eugene as an Italian French that simply was to become the greatest commander in Austrian military history. So it was an escapee from Paris, of Paris of Louis XIV, exactly during the 1683 campaign, where also his brother had been killed at Petronell, Carnuntum, in a skirmish against the Ottomans. So think about that. It was still a moment in which chivalry was a real thing, which European values as Europe, as Christendom, as faith, right, were believed in firmly by true aristocrats. Not that Louis the 14th was less, but there is a raison d'etat. I don't want to make this video just presenting Louis the 14th as a villain, right? He was just working for France pretty damn well, right? It's just that, again, somebody also thought primarily about their own honor, which is still kind of an interesting thing to believe in. In any case, there is a bit this question mark relatively to the apparent lack or shortcoming of French Ottoman diplomacy to work more on the Polish court, right? Especially as long as Vienna had been identified as the next objective. It could have been easily Krakow or Warsaw. So we don't have to think just about that. But it's there was apparently, once that the Ottomans chose Vienna, there was no diplomatic preparation from the side of the Grand Vizier trying to push away the Polish court from the empire, considering these prodromes that had seen, again, Poland aligned essentially with France and not with the Ottomans. It's too far to say that from a Polish perspective, but still, right, in kind of a maintaining a distance with the Habsburgs. The Ottomans could make leverage on that, especially considering that they needed, say, pacified fronts in other areas. But this is also what didn't quite happen. Perhaps they feared to scare the Poles by still making mess in Ukraine. This is interesting to think, because it shows also what kind of the attitude was towards Christendom in general. And it would have probably not taken that much. I mean, it would have been probably useful just to reassure John III of the effective and concrete will to respect the peace of Suravno, not to attempt any other forms of expansion north of the Black Sea. And it also, but it's more even less clear why Louis XIV didn't advise. Apparently, we don't know naturally the full dialogues, let's say, of what happened behind the scenes and what we can trace documentarily. But let's say that the Sun King didn't advise Constantinople, right? After all, the Marquis of Nointel, that was the French ambassador in Constantinople, and it was watching constantly the situation there. We know that. Didn't make an effort in that sense. It's likely that both in Paris and in Constantinople, the governments were convinced that the choices of the King of Poland, pushed, if not in great part determined by his energetic and really very loved wife, right? They were a very good couple. They would have not anyhow ever favored directly or indirectly France, right? Probably they thought that the court of Warsaw was, so insecure, maybe because of the Ottoman and Tartar pressure, that it would just turn towards the internal cause, in a sense, or internal defense, maybe. So they didn't try to attract it again towards France and distancing it from the Habsburgs more. And probably from a historiographical point of view, it's also greatly overlooked as a consequence how much this loss of opportunity was, affected the events of 1683, because we all know how crucial the Polish help was for Vienna, and how few it took, how much it took to bring the Poles in. So imagine at the beginning even a greater pressure exercised on Poland not to side with the Habsburgs by such powerful neighbors like the Ottomans, and France. It was not a neighbor, but still, it's as if influence arrived up to there directly. Could have avoided, in fact, this involvement, because consider it. This is not just a matter of simply taking sides out of sheer principle. Again, I made that video on all the diplomatic effort just to put together the army, etc. They lost time, right? The Poles wanted the command of the Catholic army, not the emperor around. I mean, there was that kind of rivalry. It wasn't the thing, all the Christians together. That's not history, right? It never existed. And it's counterfactually correct, if anything, especially in that case. And in general, or at least at these levels of politics, right, that are, we know it, they are overwhelmingly documented in this sense. And just think about the stability that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth could derive, in a sense, from in those years before 1683, from a further, okay, we will not let you, we will not pressure you, but just don't join the Habsburgs. It's difficult to say. Maybe the surplus gained by Poland would have brought even a more easy intervention in the end, or maybe that would have made overestimating their own abilities. We don't know, but surely the 1683 events would have been very different in a way or another, right? Maybe the Christians would have still won, but in another way, with another balance, with something that would have modified the relations afterwards as well, or maybe this would have even brought to the Muslim victory. Who knows? Just things do not go that way. And of course, I don't want to underestimate either the name, the glory, the Christian cause, the Catholic cause. That after all, even France as a Catholic kingdom was not marrying at all, because it was actually pushing in the opposite direction. So anyhow, For today, let's say I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.